course, continued its pledge to beat the Russians to the moon. John F. Kennedy was there to challenge America as well, to say that we can beat the Russians to the moon, we can win the space race. And we did win that space race. In 1969, an American lands and walks on the moon. Here we have that iconic photo. NASA continued its exploration of outer space with many successes and sadly far too many failures. Here you see the Challenger as it exploded shortly after takeoff. The International Space Station's establishment in the late 1990s was a major step forward, both in scientific progress but also in international cooperation, because both the Russians and the Americans utilized the space station along with a large number of other international scientists. And more recently, we have made it to Mars with the rover, collecting samples so that we can learn more about the red planet. So what's next in this space race? Expeditions to other planets? Settlements on the moon? Maybe interstellar space missions? Or perhaps outer space becoming a militarized battleground? We now consider the regulation of outer space. Prior to the First World War, there were several theories on a nation-state's relationship to the air above it. On one end of the spectrum was that collection of countries that argued, using the old Latin phrase usque ad coelum, that a nation's sovereignty extends into the heavens. There are no limits. The country enjoys ownership over everything above it. On the other end of the spectrum, some countries argued for res communis, or common heritage, meaning that airspace is open to all. It can be explored by any, and no nation state can claim sovereignty over it. The point in between would be a line separating airspace from outer space, with the nation state enjoying sovereignty up until that point. And then above, it would be res communis. The experience in World War I greatly influenced the global consensus on airspace law. The Germans in particular were able to use their air balloons. They did so for purposes of espionage, for the movement of troops, and for the dropping of bombs. And it's also in World War I that we saw military aircraft play a very important role in the outcome of battles. As a result of that experience, shortly thereafter at the Paris Convention, it was determined that each nation-state owns the airspace above it. Usque ad coelum became the reigning principle to regulate airspace and outer space. Sovereignty extending into the heavens, permission must be requested and provided before any aircraft can enter into the airspace of another country. Sputnik changed all of that. In the late 1950s, we experienced something called rebus sextentibus, a fundamental change of circumstance that renders existing law irrelevant. When the Soviet Union was able to put a satellite in outer space orbiting the Earth, it shattered the idea that nation-states could effectively control airspace into the heavens. Immediately, it was understood we need a line separating airspace, which is the sovereign domain, the territory of the country, from outer space, which is res communis, or common heritage. So we then moved from one end of the spectrum to the center. Negotiations were underway to determine exactly where that point would be, that line separating airspace from outer space. What does the new legal regime look like? Well, there is consensus that below this line is the airspace of a nation. It is their sovereignty. Above that line is outer space, common heritage, open to all for exploration, and no one can claim it as their own territory. State sovereignty versus common heritage. The problem is we don't have a consensus on that line. Earlier I mentioned the Kármán line, that's 62 miles. That is rapidly being challenged by mathematicians who argue actually 50 miles makes a lot more sense. And then we have the United States, whose position is it's unnecessary to have a global consensus on the dividing line between airspace and outer space. We don't need to do so, and each nation state can determine, based upon their capabilities, where the line separating air and outer space exists. One of the reasons that the United States does not want a very high divide between common heritage and state sovereignty is that we have advanced military aircraft that can fly very high, but certainly not 50 miles high, in order to spy on other countries. So if the line is low enough that our aircraft can fly above it, we're technically in outer space, common heritage, but we're spying on other countries. This is the Red Bull space jump from a few years ago. He leaps from 96,000 feet. It certainly looks like outer space, and it was billed as a space jump. But as you can see, that's only 18 miles up. For most of the world, between 50 and 62 miles is where outer space begins. Codification of the legal regime. Now, legal regime means a collection of international agreements relating to a particular topic. In this case, it's outer space. It doesn't mean that the treaty has to be exclusively about outer space, but rather it has an important impact on the laws regulating outer space. The very first treaty is the 1963 Limited or Partial Test Ban Treaty, because this treaty, during the Kennedy administration, made it illegal to test nuclear devices in outer space. Then there was the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, followed by the more specific 1979 Moon Treaty. These three documents make up the corpus, the body of the legal regime on outer space, and what they say collectively is that outer space is common heritage, meaning every nation state can explore it, that when astronauts go up, they are envoys of humanity, that states are responsible for whatever they put in outer space, and that no military use of outer space will be permitted. These are the countries that have signed and or ratified the Outer Space Treaty. Those in green have ratified. Those in yellow, Horn of Africa, a few countries in South America, Middle East, they have signed, but they have not ratified. And then those in red have neither signed nor considered ratification. As you can see, this is considered a universal treaty, and all of the space nations are represented in the register. In the 1980s, there was a grave challenge to the basic regime principles of outer space because the United States, under the Reagan administration, pursued Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or what many of its critics and even proponents referred to as Star Wars. This is the militarization of outer space for defensive purposes. Let's begin with the logic of Strategic Defense Initiative. If the Soviet Union was to launch an ICBM, nuclear-capable missile, towards the United States, there are three stages where we have an opportunity to attack it. There is the initial stage, that is from the blast, the launch, up until roughly the outer edges of airspace. The problem is that Siberia is so far away and it takes so little time for that rocket to reach the limits of airspace, we probably could not bring it down effectively. Add to that the fact that we don't really know where that missile is heading. It could be a test fire. It could be aimed at the ocean. We really don't know that, and if we're going to shoot down every Soviet missile the moment they're launched, that could very quickly lead to a tit for tat and a rapid escalation of conflict. So stage one, launch to outer space, is out. Stage three, when the missile returns from outer space and begins its descent, is also highly problematic because of the technology of the 1970s and early 1980s called MIRV, Multiple Independently Targeted Re-Entry Vehicles. What this means is that one ICBM, upon re-entry, could open up and release 4, 5, or perhaps even more independently targeted re-entry vehicles, each one of which is nuclear capable. So suddenly, if that missile reaches the American airspace, it turns into 4 or 5 nuclear bombs almost immediately. Taking all of those out would be a grave challenge. So it really only leaves us with stage 2, which is outer space. As noted earlier, there is no friction. That means objects move in a very clean, straight, consistent line. That means the missile is highly vulnerable to attack if we have defensive capabilities in outer space. Star Wars, or Strategic Defense Initiative, was designed to reside in outer space, to wait for the ICBM to enter outer space, begin its long, flat plane of travel, and then shoot it with a laser, causing it irreparable damage. Or if that technology wasn't ready, simply throw a bunch of rubble in front of it, metal and the like, that the spacecraft would then fly into, causing it great damage. That's the logic of Strategic Defense Initiative. What was Mr. Reagan really after? This is a question we cannot answer all of these decades later. There are a couple of viable possibilities. Maybe he really did want to provide a nuclear umbrella for the United States, to protect us against a Soviet first strike, to protect us against the first strike of any other nuclear nation, or maybe to protect us against an accidental launch. When pressed on the issue by our allies, Mr. Reagan said, we'll share it with Western Europe. When pressed further, he argued we might even share it with the rest of the world. Fine. Defensive purposes, that was one option. Other end of the spectrum, and what Moscow feared greatly, was that the United States wanted to deny Russia a second strike capability. The superpowers had pursued a policy called MAD, mutually assured destruction, throughout much of the Cold War. If one superpower strikes the other with nuclear weapons, there is a mutually assured destruction because the other can absorb the attack and then launch a counterattack that's so devastating that neither side would survive. So if our aim with SDI is to deny a second strike, then the real purpose of SDI is to make possible a first strike against the Soviet Union that ends MAD, but it also creates a great deal of instability. Finally, option number 3, maybe SDI was just a bargaining chip. We're going to pursue it, understanding we're going to gain a lot of scientific knowledge, breakthroughs, and insights just from pursuing it. But we'll always have it there to trade off against something large that the Soviet Union has to offer. That theory was tested in 1986 when we have the historic summit in Reykjavik, Iceland. Mr. Reagan on the right, Mr. Gorbachev on the left. They met in Iceland. They talked about nuclear weapons. And very quickly it became clear a lot was on the table. Major issues like an intermediate range nuclear force treaty. This is a treaty that would eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons that had never been done before. These are the medium-range missiles that were in Central Europe. Then there was the historic possibility of the zero-out option, where the Americans and the Soviets, at the time with over 98% of all nuclear weapons on the planet, would agree to zero out all nuclear warheads. It became abundantly clear, however, as they left Reykjavik and that historic house, that no deal had been reached. Not on an historic level, not on a major level. However, it did pave the way for the later signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. First time ever, an entire class of nuclear weapons is eliminated. These two world leaders deserved a Nobel Peace Prize for this document. They would not receive it. Strategic Defense Challenges, SDI, was it ever even possible to reach the point of defending our country from outer space? One of the great challenges was the cost of it. Amazingly expensive. Next is the feasibility. Will it even work? The idea of brilliant pebbles, which is basically throwing space trash in the likely path of an ICBM, was developed because we were having real challenges developing the lasers to target and to destroy the ICBMs. The legality certainly was a question, because the United States was a party to the Outer Space Treaty. And what we had to say in the 1980s is that for decades we've been misinterpreting the very treaty that we helped draft and we ratified. What the treaty really says is that outer space cannot be used for offensive weaponry. Defensive weaponry, like SDI, we argued, does fit within the regime and the set of laws. And of course, if we're going to militarize outer space, even for defensive purposes, it is very likely to lead to an arms race in outer space. And that is what we see today. Not because of SDI, but just because this is what major powers do. They invest enormously in research. They look to the heavens and they look for opportunity. A Chinese nuclear-capable hypersonic missile was tested in October of 2021, just about a week before this lecture was recorded. This is a game changer. As one American military elite official said, this is our Sputnik era. A low-orbit, maneuverable missile is a nightmare for the United States. We don't have this, and we don't have the ability to defend against this. We're openly admitting that. You see, the difference is that an old ICBM goes up into outer space, it travels very consistently, and in stage 3 it re-enters the atmosphere to search for its target. But the hypersonic flies much lower, Mach 5 speed, and is maneuverable. The Chinese test landed within 24 miles of its target. That's a very dangerous result of a test, because what it means is that the Chinese will need to load that weapon with a nuclear device to ensure that the target is destroyed, even if it lands several dozen miles away. The United States is taking the space race in a different direction with a space force, the development of an entirely new branch of the U.S. military devoted to outer space behavior and perhaps outer space as a battleground. Private space travel is our final consideration. It was Mr. Reagan that promoted it, mandating that NASA encourage private space flight and asking it to regulate all space flight. But it's only recently that the multi-billionaires have been able to fulfill their dreams of reaching outer space. First, it was Elon Musk with SpaceX. Then it was Richard Branson with Virgin Galactic. And then more recently, Jeff Bezos has entered the space race as well. Competitions are certainly underway in outer space. Governments are exploring the outer limits. States are rapidly moving in the direction of militarizing outer space, and private companies are commercializing the space above that line. What they'll all contend with is a very crowded field, quite literally. 6,500 plus satellites currently in orbit. That does not count all of the space garbage, the trash, the old satellites that are now defunct and falling towards Earth or burning up in their orbits. It's a bit of a danger zone leaving the airspace of nations. We are now prepared to consider American foreign policy options as they relate to outer space. The trajectory for the United States is clearly linked to the Space Force, which is the world's first and only independent space force. Question is whether or not it will lead to a new space race. The history of arms races tells us it likely will. Let's now consider the options that the United States has in its foreign policy towards outer space. On the one hand, we can look at outer space as the new military battleground. We would continue to pursue the Space Force. We would look into ways to militarize offensively or defensively the outer space region, very likely resulting in a dangerous arms race. On the other side of the coin, we could recommit to the legal regime, the treaties that make up the corpus, and those principles of outer space, pressuring other space nations to do so. We could encourage private enterprise. We could also prepare to limit individuals in their access to space, in their behavior, and in their claims in outer space, keeping in mind that the legal regimes only regulate nation states. They do not regulate individuals acting on their own or businesses that are apart from national governments. So if we are to limit individual activity, we likely have to revisit the legal regime on outer space and adapt it to 21st century realities. It is certainly within the realm of possibility that very soon we will have humans not only visiting the moon, but perhaps living there in very complex communities. While this is a very exciting time in world history, our exploration of outer space is taking on new dimensions and uncovering new realities. The United States government must think very carefully about its policy towards outer space, both relating to state behavior and individual enterprises, because we're looking at a space race that could take on a very dangerous dimension if we do not regulate it early on. Thank you for attending this lecture. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Wow, well, that certainly laid out a lot of complex issues for us to discuss. And I'm so glad that I have the real experts here to lead us in our discussion. Before I introduce them, I do want to tell our participants that there is a Great Decisions booklet that you can purchase online. Let me get a copy of it. You can purchase it online and have it mailed to you, or you can also get an ebook. Just call up Kindle and you'll be able to search Great Decisions and you'll be able to have it automatically downloaded right to your computer or your Kindle or whatever. So with that, let's begin our discussion. Again, I am so delighted to have with us people that I know will provide some enlightening information about where the US is headed with its space travel program. And first we have Dr. Andrea Harrington, who currently serves as the Dean of Space Education at Air University, where she is responsible for overseeing the West Space Seminar and Shriver Space Scholars, as well as leading Guardian education development efforts for USSF Space Delta 13. Prior to her role, she served as chair of the Department of Space Power and director of the Shriver Space Scholars Concentration at Air Command and Staff College, where she is an associate professor of military and security studies. She also serves as a member of the editorial board for the McGill Annals of Air and Space Law, New Space Journal, and the American Bar Association publication, The Air and Space Lawyer. She is a licensed attorney in Massachusetts. Second, we have Dr. Samantha Taylor, who currently serves as an assistant professor of military and security strategies in the Shriver Space Scholars and Department of Space Power at Air University, where she teaches theories of war and US joint planning and joint warfighting. Prior to her current role, she was a visiting professor at National Security and Strategy at the US Army War College, where she theorizes of war and national security policy and strategy making. Prior to that, she was postdoctoral fellow of national security affairs at the National War College. There she taught national security policy making. And she also serves as a member of the editorial board of the US Army War College Parameters. So to round out everything, we're going to have Dr. M.V. Coyote Smith. And he is an associate professor of strategic space studies, Department of Space Power, Air Command and Staff College. Now, Dr. Smith serves as faculty in the Department of Space Power, which is the first ever credited master's level professional military education program for members of the new U.S. Space Force, Joint and Allied Partners. He also serves as a course director for the Space Power 2 Strategy course, the Introduction of Air Power short course, the Space Power Theories elective, and the Comparative Strategies elective. So he also teaches courses in leadership, war theory, and war fighting. And let me tell you, all of these folks have a whole lot more to their bios. So you can see we could be here all night with just their bios, but let's cut it there because they have a lot to say. And we have already planned that Dr. Harrington is going to lead off everything by first, what is this Air University? Tell us a little bit about it and then delve into those issues that I think you think we ought to know. Dr. Harrington.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting us to be here tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity. So Air University is billed as the intellectual center of the Air and Space Forces. That's what you'll see on the gate when you pull up to Maxwell Air Force Base. So it is the location for graduate education for the Air Force, has been for the Air Force for quite some time and has been for the Space Force since its inception. You mentioned in my bio also Space Delta 13. That's the organization within Space Force that's responsible for Guardian education, so for educating US Space Force members. And so we serve as kind of the nexus between Air University and Space Delta 13 in the Space Force sponsored programs that currently exist as concentrations within Air Command and Staff College and Air War College. So Schriever Space Scholars is the concentration, the space concentration at Air Command and Staff College, where West Space Seminar is the concentration at the Air War College level. And we're all faculty members there and very excited to be teaching for the US Space Force. So moving into the disclaimer portion of our discussion, all three of us need to represent to everyone in the audience that we are here representing our own personal views as subject matter experts. We are not representing the views of the United States government or any part thereof, whether it be DoD, Space Force, or Air Force. We're only here representing our own personal views. With that behind us, my area of research and expertise is really international space law. So I want to address the portions of our video for this evening that were put together, specifically addressing the questions of international space law and trying to help clarify. Because one of the things that I have found in my career is that there are a lot of misperceptions out there about the Outer Space Treaty. So I carry around my UN space treaties, which includes the Outer Space Treaty, so that I can help folks walk through and understand what the treaty says. So the body of international space law does indeed include the Partial Test Ban Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty as articulated, but as it's stated in the Outer Space Treaty in Article 3, all of general international law does apply for outer space. So that includes a much wider breadth. I like to mention the International Telecommunications Union Constitution and Convention because of the importance of telecommunications to space activities that governs in outer space as well. But if you think of all of the other areas of international law that are relevant, there's some significant areas such as international environmental law and the law of armed conflict. So specifically on that point regarding law of armed conflict and the potential for military activities and armed conflict in space, one of the most common misperceptions that I hear about the Outer Space Treaty is that it limits the use of space to exclusively peaceful purposes, or it bans military activities in space of some particular sort or other. And that's just simply not the case. So the Outer Space Treaty does state specifically that celestial bodies, the moon and other celestial bodies, not including Earth, are to be used for exclusively peaceful purposes. So when we're talking about other celestial bodies, that is indeed a limitation. And that limitation mirrors the limitation in the Antarctic Treaty that we have for Antarctica. So you can use military personnel and equipment like we do in Antarctica for peaceful purposes, but they must be peaceful purposes. So that's true if we go to the moon, Mars, or any other celestial body. But in the void of outer space, in the place where we have orbits and we send things out into deep space, there is not a limitation that space needs to be used for exclusively peaceful purposes. There are specific limitations on nuclear weapons. So we can't station nuclear weapons in outer space more generally. But other than that, there are not specific limitations. So there's not a prohibition on the placement of weapons in space, for example, as long as they are not nuclear weapons. Of course, we do have to follow the UN Charter and other international law. So acts of aggression that would be prohibited in other areas are likewise going to be prohibited under international law, otherwise, whether it be the UN Charter or some other part of international law. So I think that's really an important place to kick off some of this discussion. In terms of the terminology, there was some conflation of res communis and the common heritage of mankind that I saw in the lead-in video. And I want to unpack that because those are actually two different terms. Common heritage of mankind is a term that comes from the Moon Agreement in an outer space context. It's also in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But for space, it's in the Moon Agreement. And the Moon Agreement only has 18 countries that have ratified it. The United States is not one of them, neither is Russia, neither is China. The major players are not part of the Moon Agreement. So that common heritage of mankind language does apply in the Moon Agreement, but not in the Outer Space Treaty or any of the other space treaties. What the Outer Space Treaty says is that space activities are the province of all mankind, which does not have the same kind of meaning, is not the same kind of defined term in international law that common heritage is. So I really do want to make that distinction. And that res communis language, that Latin term, is much more similar to the way we read space activities as the province of all mankind than it actually is to common heritage, which has a more distinct legal meaning and more restrictive legal meaning in terms of what we would be able to do in that space. I also want to talk briefly about Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which attaches state responsibility for national activities in space, whether they are carried out by the government or by a private entity or individual. So for those commercial actors that are engaging in space activities, they are to be supervised and authorized by their state. And that state is held legally responsible at the international level for anything that that private actor does, as if it was the state carrying out that behavior itself. That's distinct from other areas of international law. That's unique. That was a compromise that was negotiated between the US and the USSR to address the fact that the Soviet Union did not want to see private activities in space occurring, and the US did. And so the compromise was to say those private activities can happen, but the country that's going to allow them has to supervise and authorize them and take full responsibility for what they're doing to ensure that they are complying with international law. So even though the international law can't directly apply to the company or private individual in space, it applies through the state, where the state can be held directly responsible for anything that that private company or individual does. So it's up to the state to implement within its domestic law legal and regulatory regimes to govern those private actors to ensure their compliance with the Outer Space Treaty and international law more broadly. In terms of somewhere that we could potentially recommit collectively as an international community in the Outer Space Treaty, Article 9 talks about due regard for other states' space activities. And there are some specific mechanisms for consultations when an activity might harmfully interfere with other states' activities. And in my view, as a space lawyer, we have really underutilized that Article 9 language to try to deal with and come to terms with activities that are likely to interfere with other states' activities. So for example, if you take that ASAT test that Russia conducted late in 2021 and the amount of debris that that test created, with the full knowledge and understanding that we have in the modern era in 2021 of space debris, you could make a very strong argument that that action was not with due regard for other state space activities, that Russia should have consulted ahead of time if it was going to carry out that activity. And we could be using that language of the treaty in Article 9 proactively. So that's a place that we could come back and revisit and more proactively use the Outer Space Treaty. I know we want to move on to discussion, so I'll stop there on that point. But I will also say that aside from just the particular space law discussions, I'm also interested, especially in light of current events, in discussion on the role of the International Space Station and the role of NASA more broadly in relations with the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation. Thanks.
Thank you. That was very good. I mean, there's a lot to unpack even in what you said, but I'm glad you also brought up, made it relevant to what's happening today as one nation invades another, as Russia invades Ukraine, because as we even point out all this the legal things that you have, if people don't obey laws right here on Earth, are they going to obey them in space? You know, but anyway, we'll come back to that. Now I want to bring into our conversation Dr. Samantha Taylor. Dr. Taylor, you may unmute and offer your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you for letting us present today. And so I am a historian, and in particular, my field of expertise is Cold War to the present. And so listening to the history that was presented, there are some things that I think need a little bit more of a deep dive as well. So first off, the Sputnik was actually not the first man-made object, militarized or otherwise, to hit space. The Nazi V2, the Vengeance rockets that were used in World War II against Britain, were the first ballistic and therefore space capable devices that were used by people for any type of purpose. And it was after the demonstrations of the V2s that you see that both the United States and the Soviet Union bring those rocket designers, those rocket engineers to their countries to develop their own rocket and space capability programs. These programs were, by their nature, originally under military control. And so what we see is as the Cold War continues, there is debates going between the United States and the Soviet Union into how militarized or how civilian space will be about for each state. And so in the Soviet Union, we see that there is no division between civilian and militarized uses of space. They're both underneath the Soviet Union, the party leadership. Whereas in the United States, we see that there is a division under President Eisenhower, who proposes and promotes the national policy of peaceful uses of space. We see that there is a division in the United States that other countries moving forward have also embraced, where you see the United States space is divided between military uses and civilian uses. And so what we see is that for the United States and those that are allies that continue with us, that is in some ways the paradigm that we continue to see space being done, is that there is some military defense, offensive uses that are done in space, but there are also civilian space exploration type uses of space as well. And so that is, so the mention of the militarization of space isn't historically accurate as presented. Space, unfortunately, has always in some way been militarized. There has always been some type of military presence in space. And part of that is because the military, because it is part of state government, were the ones that had the resources and funding to be able to develop the technology needed in order to build those space rockets, space satellites that we now in some ways take for granted for what they can do for our daily lives. And what I'm referring to is this idea that during the Cold War, and as we've moved forward, space has provided a bunch of second and third order effects that have benefited humanity. Not just the idea that we reach the moon, but also computer technology was in many ways advanced by the needs of the space program. The developments of weatherological satellites, communications, global positioning, those are all things that rely on space capabilities that we have gained technological improvements on with support of the military. And so just things to think about. And so what's interesting is that in that first space race, there was a going on, you see this balancing between national prestige, but also the practicality, not just in the defense of your nation, but also in the technical capabilities that space technology gave. And so that's one of the things to keep in mind as we're thinking about space, is that it's not just about how do you defend your nation, but also how do you get the satellites that can track, hurricanes and tornadoes and other really bad weather storms? How do you get the technology that allows different drivers to be able to drive from one location to the next? How do we do global communications, not just on the internet, but also on your cell phone? And so when we think about this space capability, it has increasingly expanded beyond what was originally considered capable with space. And so when you think about the history of space, and you think about this evolution of space technology, the evolution of how governments, both on the military, the civilian, interact with each other in developing and cooperating to develop this technology, we now see the introduction of commercial entities that also bring another aspect and another pursuit of prestige and practicality to going about incorporating and engaging in space. And what we see is that one of the introductions of the commercial space entities is it now allows more actors, whether it's a state or another company or another group to get some type of capability that they need into space. So whether it's a communication satellite, or it's like Starlink, or it's a meteorological or a GPS device, from low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, to geostation, geoeconomic. Coyote, I need a little bit of help. Low Earth orbit, middle Earth orbit, helioelliptical Earth orbit, geostationary Earth orbit. There's a lot there to keep in track of. And so each of those orbits give different capabilities and uses for what we can do in space. And so when we're thinking about these space capabilities and understanding from the military, the scientific, the commercial, the private, there are all of these different advantages and benefits to be aware of that space gives us, that started out and kind of started with that during a war, that have led to both peaceful and less peaceful uses of space. And with that, I turn it over to the Coyote.
Yeah, that's interesting the way you've described that, though, because again, it started out, as you say, military. I mean, this was a military use. We wanted to make use of outer space for defense or aggressive purposes. But then we've now uncovered all of these other things, and it looks like we're also not far away from living there, living from what they said. So this is an evolution. So let's bring in Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith, tell us what more we need to know about what clearly, I mean, all those different layers of spaces just had me boggled as well.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for having me here. And it's just terrific. I'd like to echo what Dean Harrington said. You know, the opinions I'm going to express here are my own. They're not necessarily those of the government or of the office or of the university, but they ought to be. I'm going to give you just a little bit of an idea about how our lives are penetrated by space. Here in the United States, we have 15 electrical power grids. We have not been building additional electrical power generation stations. Instead, we've been integrating the global positioning system signal into our motor generators that spin, that create the electricity, to harmonize them, to maximize their output. And also we integrate that GPS signal into the distribution of our electrical power source. You know, one of the things people don't understand yet about the establishment of the Space Force. The Space Force consumes only 2.5% of the DoD budget. That is incredibly tiny. You know, we joke that the Air Force spends more on combat boots for their enlisted troops than they do on outer space. And while that's probably an exaggeration, there's a air of truth there. But what I want you to understand is, with the capabilities that your Space Force delivers to the nation, global positioning system, weather data for farmers and for international agriculture, et cetera, with our missile warning status, with our infrared systems, with those types of systems that measure the sea heights and is fed to the international shipping community. Your Space Force is a revenue generating service. It makes money. GPS alone, the annual valuation is over $420 billion to the US economy. That's taxable revenue. That is far more than half of the DoD budget. The Space Force pays for itself in revenue every 11 days. Do you really want to get rid of that now? No. Why do we have a separate Space Force? Well, just as I point out the integration of GPS into our electrical power grid, think about what you use electricity for. Almost everything that you do in your life. The air conditioning is on, the lights are on, and if we lost GPS, those 24 satellites that provide that timing data, all of a sudden, our electrical power grids across this nation would go into an over-demanded state. They are operating right now at about 137% of their overall design life performance factor. So we would have a 37% deficit of energy that could not be created. And this would cause blackouts and grayouts across the electrical power grid and create mayhem. We do not want that. But think about the other things. When you wake up in the morning, you turn on your television and you're watching news shows, which are satellite images sent to you from all around the world that are fused at a news network center. And you're a consumer of that space-related data. Maybe you jump into your car and you drive to some unknown location your boss has asked you to go to, and you're using GPS. You know, that GPS signal in all of your mobile phones, the reason why your mobile phones have that high speed and are able to make the connection to the mobile phone data, to the mobile phone towers, is because those ones and zeros are made intelligible by that GPS signal. It's an amazing, remarkable signal that we are so dependent upon. But the other thing I'd like to point out is because of GPS and the degree of penetration into the transportation industry, we estimate now that our efficiency of transportation is made between 17 and 22% more efficient. Let me translate that again. That means we are consuming between 15 and 22% fewer calories of energy, perhaps carbon contaminating energy, for our transportation needs. People go direct without getting lost. They also take the most direct routes now. That is a consequential type of contribution, and we include that in our overall estimate in providing that free to the world from our global positioning system. Now, over the course of my 30-year Air Force career, and I retired as a colonel, I served in various flying, missile, and space assignments. As I listened to the presentation that we were given tonight, I was struck by the overemphasis and the relationship given between space and nuclear warfare. Well, when in 1983, Ronald Reagan gave his Strategic Defense Initiative talk, which, as it was pointed out, was characterized as Star Wars the next day, that system did not materialize. But as the Cold War came to an end and the nuclear arsenals of the primary antagonists declined, the arms control community, which was a cottage industry at the time, was running out of jobs. I mean, what are they going to do? But Reagan had given them an issue that allowed them to bridge into a new area, and that was space. And they continued to relate nuclear warfare and space weaponization as a foil to continue to convince Congress not to invest in space, that somehow that was risky or dangerous. Well, as it would turn out, the genesis for the US Space Force really started after 2014 during Barack Obama's administration. President Obama was coming back across the ocean in Air Force One, and he had aircraft join up, American fighters join up to give him an escort back to the States. And he asked the question, why are we getting such a nice reception? And he was told, well, Mr. President, we have had some satellite jamming, and because of that, the Air Force comes out and makes sure that we get home safely. Okay, wait a minute. I've been told that it's impossible to jam a satellite. And besides, we have treaties against that. No one would ever do that. To which the response was, Mr. President, are you seeing the daily satellite interference reports that are up-channeled through the National Security Council? And he was not. So one of our generals went and briefed the president on the space threats that we see out there. And he was shocked by that and asked for the briefing again a couple of days later. And he did receive that briefing. And he was apparently so concerned about this. He said, look, I want every member of Congress indoctrinated into these threats, and I want them to receive this briefing. And Congressman Jim Cooper from Tennessee was one of the largest advocates, along with Congressman Mike Rogers out of Alabama, who grabbed a hold of that briefing and said, look, we have got to do something. The United States Air Force had been under multiple studies over about 40 years on how they were maturing space. The Air Force's primary mission is air power. And whenever any budget challenge came up, the Air Force was always properly willing to trade away second and third order missions in order to cover its deficit on air. And that would oftentimes be space and cyber. And so Congress realized that they needed to step in order to create a protection for the space budget so that the trade-offs for air power would not necessarily come from space. Because as I pointed out, that's a profit-generating center for the United States of America and for our allies. And we are doing a public good for the rest of the world with the type of services that we provide. When you pour yourself a bowl of cereal in the morning, you might want to think about the fact that we have satellites that go overhead of our farmland and study and measure the quality of the soil in those farms. And that information is downloaded to those farmers who have heavily automated tractors now. And they have differential fertilizers and differential herbicides, et cetera. And when farmers go across their fields, they are using space-derived data to standardize and optimize that field for the crop that they're planting to maximize their food output for a hungry world going to 8 billion people in our lifetimes. The value of space is not just shared with American farmers, but through our diplomatic engagements overseas, we are assisting nations, developing nations all around the world, identify agricable land so that they can feed themselves locally. Feeding themselves locally is one of the largest initiatives that we have. The United Nations has been very supportive of that. And the Office of Outer Space Affairs at the United Nations in Vienna has been a significant contributor to our ability to reach out and provide those types of services to other nations. And so with that, I want you to know that you have a force for good in your United States Space Force. And we are excited about continuing to expand the protection and the defense of commerce in space. The overall estimated material value of space post-transactionally is estimated between the moon and the asteroid belt of being over $17 quintillion worth of rare minerals, et cetera. And the habitation potential of the moon and Mars is just going to get better as our technology focuses us in on those types of survival sciences that we'll need to thrive there. And so it's with a great deal of excitement that I turn this back to you, moderator, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Well, you've got me excited too about space. That's pretty incredible. What we've had here is basically a look beginning with how space and the legality of it is all managed, and that's a complicated thing because you got to know who's supposed to do what and who's going to be responsible when something goes wrong. So that was mind-boggling. Then we moved into the history of how all of this happened and where it's gone, and the fact that it's now not just about war, it's about living. And then we delve into with you the exciting things that space has made happen, that the space exploration has made happen on a daily basis, including intensifying the ability for us to survive because we can grow foods much easier. But anyway, all of that is fascinating. But let me just delve into one thing. I get it. I get how they could slowly take money away, and because that's not so important. But why, you don't think this would have been better protected staying with the US Air Force and couldn't they simply X out the budget? Or as you also pointed out, they don't seem to be allocating enough money anyway to you. So tell me, why wouldn't it be better protected under the existing Air Force?
The Air Force is about air power, and they will sacrifice second and third order missions to take care of air power. The only missions that they were interested in was close space support to combat aircraft. There's a mantra out there that says space only exists for support to the warfighter. And we're telling them, no, we have to support the global economy 24/7, 365 days a year. Warfare, fortunately for the American experience, is a tiny little experience. And it occurs on some small little spot, given the rotundity of the earth, the immensity of the earth. And we're at peace everywhere else. And we can't stop doing what we do to support commerce, diplomacy, and intelligence and information collection around the globe because we've got a war going on in some little theater. It's much larger than the perspective of your warfighting terrestrial services. The Space Force is not just a warfighting service. We will support warfare when it happens. But our primary value to the American public, not only as a revenue generating capability, but is in delivering those capabilities to enable our economy, our allies' economy, and the global economy. And so the Air Force, like when it was underneath the Army was unwilling to let the Air Force develop air superiority, or the ability to go deep and bomb into the enemy's territory. The Army was only interested in close air support to ground forces. And so much like that, because of the way priorities of organizations and rice bowls are set up, We have to have an independent Space Force if we're going to get to those types of systems that will protect and defend your satellites from attack on orbit, not just our military satellites, but our fleet of commercial satellites. And to give you an idea how that is growing, right now we have about 4,000 satellites on orbit. We have registered right now over 40,000 satellites going to orbit before the end of this decade. And before the International Telegraphic Union, there was licensing requests for over 300,000 satellites before the end of the next decade. Why is this important? Here in the United States and the Western world, our infrastructure, our poles and our wires are aging. And even, some of our our cables, they can't carry the type of high traffic data that we're demanding all the time. And it's getting even more so. And so we either have to rip out and replace all of those wires across the West, or we go the cheap way and move our telecommunications industry and all of our computing and all of our other techno cyber type of capabilities to the backbone of space. Space will be the infrastructure for the Earth.
This is so exciting. This is true. I went into the wrong profession. I should have gone into space exploration. But
And if I could pop in to
please
that
do.
as well,
Yeah.
as Dr. Smith mentioned, the Air Force priority is air, and so it has not prioritized spending money. Historically, has fought to find money to spend to invest in developing and researching space capabilities, space technology, and when it did, as it has been prioritized to how it can support Air Force. And so as we have seen as the expansion of that technology, the fact that now it's not just military defending against and detecting missile launches, but it's now communication. It is now knowing where you're going. It is now knowing what the weather is going to be in the next, what is it, 2 weeks?
Yeah.
That they can give you a
Get
good
mad when
weather
it's wrong.
forecast.
Yeah.
Seeing where the droughts are, how bad they are, seeing how the rain tables is, seeing how the snow packs are doing, seeing how badly things are thawing and
Yep.
then freezing back up. And so there's a lot more to what space can be done that the Air Force didn't foresee. And because of that, it limited what space capabilities were being developed by space. And so in some ways, the introduction of commercial space corporations means that there are now different perspectives into what you can use and space for.
Well, that makes sense because even as you guys have pointed out, the introduction, the commercial part with individual actors involved here, that blows out anything that the U.S. Air Force should be doing. But let me go back to Dean Harrington and just to clarify a little bit more about the legal organization of space. I mean, one of the things I guess that I was struck with is that the rich people who are going to space, right? We're still responsible as a country for what they do or what they don't do. So I'm wondering, what is that? That must be a whole legal arm of space also, because more and more people are going to try to get into this private space thing. So how are they going to be regulated, and how are we going to protect our own taxpayers from what they might or might not do in space, right? But on the other hand, this is where I'm going to ask you to do. How are we going to enforce these laws? If there are laws and if people do, how are we going to enforce them? Dean.
So you will be pleased and relieved to hear that we have a robust body of domestic space law in the United States that is specifically designed to, first of all, uphold our legal obligations in the international law regime, but also to protect our interests through domestic law, right, in more detail than is required by the international regime. So if you look to Title 51 of the US Code, that's where you will find all of our space law, our domestic space law that does regulate commercial activities in space. There's a licensing and permitting regime that exists. So any proposals for space activities get reviewed in advance, questions asked, right, to ensure that those proposals are in line with US laws and US policy before they get launched. They have licenses from the FCC to continue to use the radio frequencies that they're using while they're in space. If they are not following along with the requirements of their license and with the requirements of US law, the United States can revoke that license. So that can affect ongoing operations. If they can't use those radio frequencies, how else do you communicate with space? If you're talking about a company that regularly engages in a multitude of space activities, going back to Coyote's reference to the thousands of satellites that are planning to be launched, they could be not allowed to get any future licenses depending on the severity of the breach, right? So there are penalties that can be imposed on those companies in that context of domestic law to ensure that they comply. And if you want to know how advanced our domestic law really is, we even since 2015 have a law on the books in the United States to regulate extraction and use of space resources. So what you would call space mining from asteroids for private companies that want to go out and acquire those resources. So our companies aren't technologically there yet and doing it yet, although we have companies that have proposed and are working on those initiatives, but we've actually got our law in place ready to deal with that challenge. So I hope that helps to set your mind at ease a little bit in terms of the questions of how that space law works for the United States and the US taxpayer. And we do require insurance. Speaking of the money, when you mentioned the taxpayer, we require insurance because we are liable internationally for damage that's caused. So that insurance is required to cover up to what's called a maximum probable loss is the technical term, so that there's a company there that's an insurance company that's going to cover that, or the company has to prove that they have the assets on hand to be able to self-insure, so that money will get paid out so that it will protect the United States from that.
Interesting. And internationally speaking, how would one country, let's say you damaged my rocket up here or my missile, how would one country file a suit or deal with another country that they say it's hurt whatever they have in outer space, and what would be those repercussions?
So there's a whole range of possibilities for resolving that kind of a dispute. The sort of lowest and easiest form of that resolution would happen through diplomatic channels. So the Cosmos 954 satellite that crashed into Canada, or it was a Russian satellite that crashed in Canada, had a small nuclear power generator on board. And that nuclear power source certainly was a concern in crashing in the Canadian landscape, that it might cause contamination. The Russians, in line with the requirements under the treaties, offered to come in and help the Canadians clean it up. The Canadians said no, because they're not required to accept that offer. The Canadians cleaned it up with American help and then sent Russia a bill for the cost of that cleanup because their satellite had crashed into Canada. And there was a negotiation of those costs. And so Canada asked for $6 million. Russia ultimately paid $3 million to Canada in an ex gratia payment just to get it resolved. I would argue, although it's not clearly stated anywhere in the texts of these agreements, which you can find online, that some of that is probably Russia saying, well, we shouldn't have to pay the full amount because it would have been cheaper if you let us come in and help clean it up. And that's my guess as to how that negotiation went about. But that worked as designed, right? We have a liability convention, we have the Outer Space Treaty. States can negotiate directly with each other on a diplomatic basis to resolve issues as needed. The liability convention also establishes how you would get a claims commission. If you need a claims commission, if you can't resolve it just diplomatically, you can have this claims commission form. It looks a lot like an arbitral tribunal where each of the two countries picks one of the members of the panel, and then those two pick the third member of the panel, just like you would for arbitration, and they can determine the resolution of that claim. And finally, if both states consented to going to the ICJ, it could go to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to be resolved that way, or anything in that range of options, right? A mediation, an arbitral tribunal, an actual, regular old arbitral tribunal using the Permanent Court of Arbitration or not, right? Range of peaceful dispute resolution mechanisms. But the law is there to use as a tool so that states can get to that peaceful, beneficial resolution of that problem.
I see. So while we've all been sleeping, you guys have been busy figuring all of this stuff out for the 21st century. Okay. One of the questions that's come in is, what are the ramifications of the rupture in the US-Russia relations on space projects and initiatives? Who wants to take that one?
If you don't mind if I start out.
Yeah, don't mind.
So I want to look very briefly at the history of US, first Soviet, and then Russian relations in space. Because if you go back to the 70s, you had the Apollo-Soyuz docking maneuver, which was a cooperative endeavor between the Soviet Union and the United States. in the midst of the Cold War, right? So this was a major breakthrough in diplomacy and interaction between those states for the Apollo-Soyuz docking. So fast forward into the 80s, the United States is planning with its allies, not with the Soviet Union, but with its allies, a space station called Space Station Freedom to send up. And ultimately, the Soviet Union collapses, and you get the Russian Federation and other states that emerge from that collapse. And an opportunity is seen to expand that project and bring in the Russian Federation. So the project gets renamed. It's no longer Space Station Freedom. It becomes the International Space Station and proceeds adding Russia to the list of countries that are participating in that endeavor. And we get the International Space Station of today, which is important because if you look at the tensions that have arisen, ebbed and flowed throughout the course of the ISS history, you can look, for example, at the Crimean incident that occurred, and the one place that you really did not see a breakdown in US-Russian relations at that point was for the International Space Station. Operations continued normally. NASA and Roscosmos had regular communication. And at that point, we were dependent on the Russians for access to the space station, because if you recall, that was after we retired the space shuttle, but before SpaceX was able to bring astronauts up. So we continued with dependence getting our astronauts to the space station from the Russians. Fast forward to now, now we do have our own native capability once again to get astronauts to and from the space station, so we're not dependent on Russia for that. NASA actually did come out, I was checking right before we got started tonight, NASA came out and made a statement today that ISS operations are not affected, still planning for the regular schedule of events, including the return of astronauts and cosmonauts and sending them up. They're not expecting any breach or disruption in ISS operations or the communications between NASA and Roscosmos required for ISS operations. If you've been following the news with regard to space in particular, Rogozin, the head of Roscosmos, has been tweeting things about, well, I'm not really happy with what the US is doing, but International Space Station cooperation is going strong. We really like working with NASA, right? So that is one area where we can still have connectivity until and unless it gets to such a point. Obviously, there could be a potential breaking point, and seeing how that would be resolved would be really significant because that would be unprecedented. Right? We've made it through a number of other crises without that breaking down. But it provides a useful tool, a useful conduit of exchange, potentially where other conduits of diplomacy might become closed off or inoperable for various reasons. But when you have human beings living and working in space that require that support and that are so publicly tracked, right? Everybody's constantly, or at least in my, maybe it's just not on the space world, but everybody knows the space station is up there and that we have astronauts and cosmonauts up there. It's an important thing in the public mind. So if something went really wrong there, I think that would be very symbolic for the state of affairs.
What's symbolic also is that we can be at war on Earth, but in peace, living in peace in outer space. That is what I find fascinating. There also was the question that came in. We're hearing that Russian cyber attacks on our electrical grid could be devastating. So can someone speak about what role, if any, does the Space Force play in defending us against that kind of thing?
If I could, I'll take a crack at that.
Please.
I go to bed at night worrying about this type of stuff. We have not made the systematic investments to protect and defend our critical space infrastructure from such attacks. We have done a much better job in just the last, I'd say, 10 years of improving our encryption on our space-related systems, on doing a little hardening on them, but the world is filling up with counter space jammers, lasers, microwave weapons, etc. If you would take a look, if you could have access to the unbelievable classified briefing that we've received here a few times, and that is sitting on the front of the president as well, you would be as scared as President Obama was, and made sure that the members of Congress became informed. Now, we need to do better. We need to do a lot better, because I'm not just worried about those cyber-related attacks, which can be pretty grave, but I'm worried about those electronic attacks against those satellites. They are sitting there incredibly vulnerable. And a few years ago, there was an Air Force Space Command general, before we created a Space Force, who was asked by Congressman Jim Cooper in a session of the Select Subcommittee on Strategic Forces for the House Armed Services Committee, what he was doing to protect and defend satellites from attack. And his response was, well, we'll use multi-domain operations. We reserve the right to respond to a threat or an attack in any of the other operating medium. And the congressman said, okay, you're a senior leader in Air Force Space Command. You just told me protecting and defending satellites from attack is someone else's job. And that's kind of the situation that we're in today. Now, your Space Force, as you may notice, is not leaping before it looks. We are taking a very careful, measured assessment of where the threats lie and how to actually protect and defend those satellites. We not only want to protect our satellites, but those satellites under US and allied registry as well. I want you to think kind of like a Navy at sea. Think of space as a new ocean, and your Space Force is going to be much like a Navy sailing in space, providing protective convoys, maybe providing escort destroyers, etc. Those kinds of things. Now, we don't have a sense of shock or fear because we have naval ships at sea. In fact, we feel a great deal of gratitude because they assist in the free flow of commerce. They keep the sea lines of communication open. They provide law enforcement through our Coast Guard on them. And you will find the same thing, the same natural, normal human behaviors will evolve in space as we get our arms better around the technology and make the type of systematic investments in order to solve those problems.
Thank you. That was very, very enlightening. Dr. Taylor, as we close, I want to ask, I'm going to ask each one of you to have some closing remarks, but I want to ask you, as you look, since you're the historian, and you look at where it began and where it's going, you know, particularly, I'm just curious, how quickly do you think we will have someone, an actual settlement, like, you know, on space? And where do you see this going in the next decade?
So I think in the next decade, I see probably led by commercial entities, because as we know, SpaceX, part of their mission, why they were created, was to get people to Mars. And so I see within the next decade, further exploration, further preparation, further development of technology necessary to make those settlements happen. I see us returning to the moon with the Artemis. It might not happen as soon as we would like because of all the technology and things that tend to go wrong when you're messing with things in space. But I think that we will eventually get back there. And it will not just be Americans, but it will be an international group like what we have done in the International Space Station. And I think that it will be a bit more contested because there are more nations and more states that are in space, and because not all of us have the same ideas of what it means to be peaceful, what it means for the benefits of mankind. And we will have to, as we continue to expand the human interactions in space, do a better job of finding consensus for those norms about what we really can and cannot do in space. Space will continue to be militarized. Whether it becomes weaponized is something I am not sure I want to try to think about in the next 10 years, because that's a bit too frightening to think about. But I do see that we will, as things go forward, because we now have we have individuals that are pushing for a return to human exploration, to human research, to human understanding of space, that we will eventually get back to space. We will begin to advance those technologies necessary to have long-term human possible settlements somewhere out in space. Probably the moon, because it's closer and it's easier to launch stuff there.
Do you think that's within a decade or longer than a decade? I just want to know if I'm going to be alive.
I think if someone gives another Kennedy speech, you know, and rearing Americans and the rest of the world to get humans to space, we'll get there.
All right. Dr. Harrington, I'm assuming we've made a lot of progress. So in your closing remarks, would you talk about what needs to be done legally to prepare for this new frontier?
Okay, well, so there are a lot of areas that could use some clarification in terms of responsible behavior in space. And this is probably a term that you've heard thrown around if you've looked into what's going on in space. what's responsible behavior in space? How do we continue to use and explore outer space sustainably with the numbers of satellites and missions that folks are sending up? And there's technical stuff there, right? About how safe, how closely can you safely approach another object in space, whether you're talking about in orbit, whether you're talking about a rover on the surface of a celestial body, how close is too close, right? How much debris is too much debris? Can we clean up debris that's up there now? And all of these types of questions. So getting these questions answered, not necessarily in a binding legal document, but in some form or means for states to be able to come to cooperation and be able to agree to some basic premises of how we engage in space activities to ensure that it is still available to future generations, I think is going to be important. And getting a legally binding solution certainly would be beneficial, but there's very little political will for multilateral binding treaties these days. There are a lot of mechanisms I could talk about how you can use these non-binding or soft law documents to be able to generate norms of behavior. I don't think we have the time to go into that tonight, but that is certainly a tool that we could use. But at a fundamental level, looking at what's going on in the world literally today, on this very day, I think there are some serious questions about the future of international law more broadly, right? Not specifically space, nothing relating to just directly space. Although that Russian ASAT test in late 2021 calls into question some of that due regard in outer space, which goes to the international space law regime specifically, but the challenges to sovereignty, territorial independence, political independence, sovereign equality, right? All UN charter stuff that's being called into question as we speak. And so if those sort of fundamental underlying jus cogens norms of international law are being called into such significant question, then we have to ask, what can we do to shore up international law so that our space law regime is also useful in the context of this larger international law regime? And I think that's a major challenge that the international community is facing far more broadly than just let's talk about norms of behavior in space.
Brava, Dr. Harrington. I think that was well put. It's what we're all worried and thinking about right now. If you don't have law on earth, how are you going to have it abided by it in the heavens? But Dr. Smith, we're going to let you have the last word.
Well, I tell you, my hope for the future is that the commercial sector will continue to expand into outer space, and that your Space Force will be adequately funded to protect and defend those celestial lines of communications, those key points, and those areas of great interest where our commercial sectors need to go to expand the human presence beyond Earth. I share Bezos and Musk's vision that we need to get to a time where humanity becomes a multi-location species. We know that 65 million years ago, an asteroid came in and slammed into the invented the Gulf of Mexico because it hit so hard. That's a crater. It's called the Chicxulub crater, and it snuffed the age of dinosaurs and made possible the rise of mammals. Now, while I am happy about the rise of mammals, I'm not happy about the possibility that we could find ourselves being snuffed by an asteroid as well. We need to have a system of planetary asteroid defense, warning systems, and counter systems. And we have been working on those types of ideas, but it's time to actually start putting some investment in there. Stephen Hawking was famous for quoting actually Sir Arthur C. Clarke, who said that the dinosaurs died because they did not have a space program. And if we die because we don't have a space program, it will serve us right. And I'd like to give those two gentlemen the final word.
Wow, that's well, you've certainly now got a disciple. You've convinced me, and I was a little bit skeptical about whether we need a separate force, but I get it. I think I get it now. And not only that, in my other hat, I'm an opinion writer, an editorial writer. So I may be writing about this so thousands more people will have this kind of enlightenment. So they just check out Penn Live and the Patriot News. That's the newspaper. And so we will be writing about this as well, and maybe using some snippets from our conversation tonight. I have to tell you, doctors, I have been more than overwhelmed. I have been so pleased at the conversation. I had no idea that we would get into all these different aspects. Thank you, first of all, Dr. Taylor, for recommending that I bring in your two colleagues as well. You have truly done a service to us in our community. So thank you all. And I hope one day we can invite you to continue the conversation because space ain't going anywhere. Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. And thanks for everyone for participating. Good night.